So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Managing Our Planet seminar, which is a joint series run by George Mason University and the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's Brazil program and it's environmental change and security program. And we are gathered here, as always, to look at environmental issues that are at large scale and environmental solutions which are of similar scale. And so it could not be more appropriate than to have this afternoon's program on the biggest environmental agreement of all time. So I'm not going to take any more time, but I'm going to turn it over to Roger Mark de Souza, who will moderate the proceedings. Roger.
Thank you very much, Tom. And what a great turnout. Boy, we've had more than 400 RSVPs. We've actually overflowing. We have two overflow rooms, and we know we have a lot of people who are tuning in online. So we're delighted to host today's discussion. And we were just chatting briefly as before we came in, and we said, what a way to end the year. What a holiday present. So this is a really good, auspicious moment for us to be looking at the agreement and to have a sense of what has come out of it, what is the perspective from the US government, a little bit the negotiating team, what it means to the private sector, and what's a sense of the long-term policy implications. So these are the areas that we hope to cover in our short comments. I know that a lot of you have questions and points that you'd like to make. And it was interesting, just this morning I was reading a DevEx article about what came out of Paris. And it was saying, you know, we've had all of these international agreements, the International Financing for Development Conference, we've had the release of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it goes on to say the outcome of the Paris Climate Conference resonates with much the same frequency, successful to some, disappointing to others, and in many aspects still to be determined. So I hope that as we have our discussion today, we're able to discuss those three components of the agreement. And to kick us off, we have a colleague and friend from the World Resources Institute, Andrew Steer. Many of you know him quite well, the president and CEO of WRI, having come to WRI from the World Bank, where he served as special envoy for climate change from 2010 to 2012, and previously having served as the Director General at DFID, the UK Department of International Development in London. Has an impressive track record, having served and is serving on the executive board of the UN Secretary General's Sustainable Energy for All initiative, is the co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Natural Capital, and is a member of the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development, among many other things. So I'm going to hand it over to Andrew, and Andrew is going to give us a sense of what do we have coming out of the agreement? What are the main takeaways? What's the overview of the agreement? So Andrew, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Roger, and my goodness me, it's so nice to see so many friends here. All of one mind, I suspect. Although there may be some outliers out there in the audience. We'll find out. Look, I'm old enough to have been at the Rio Earth Summit. I know you, Tom, you were there too. And I actually sat there watching heads of state come in and sign the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that was, believe it or not, a moment that was really deeply moral. There was a sense that humanity was doing something really right for the future. In the 20-odd years, 23 years that's followed, we have not had much of that feeling. We've had the opposite. And even words like equity that brought us together originally pushed us apart. And in Paris, we saw the regaining of that spirit. Not through the whole 2-week process. And I know some of you could talk about that. But certainly as things moved on, and actually throughout the whole period, there was a dramatically more positive atmosphere. And I do want to give credit to our friends from the United States government who played an absolutely wonderful role in moving this forward. So thanks very much. Look, we like many of the organizations represented here, had fairly substantial teams there. We had really 2 teams, one team working on negotiations. So we had staff assigned from the different countries that we have working, actually sitting on delegations. So they were able to actually see from the inside sort of where the fault lines were. And like other organizations, our guys, met, at 6:45 every morning, and then again, sort of sometime after midnight to sort of regroup and so on. But we also had another team there that was doing what's called the action agenda. And I'll say a word about that, and I know Helen's going to say a little more about that, which was essentially using Paris using the political and financial and emotional momentum from Paris to actually launch and move forward lots of important initiatives, which in turn then fed back into the negotiating, changed the mood music. And both of them were highly successful. We, going into Paris, had lots of scenarios. We had 3 scenarios for the outcome. We even sort of had press releases written on all 3. This was the best. This was pretty much in the middle of what we hoped for. Does that mean it's perfect? No, but we knew it wasn't going to be perfect when we went into Paris. So we knew about the INDCs. Now there are 188 countries that have signed up to actual commitments, something absolutely unthinkable 3 years ago, quite remarkable. When I was in Paris, I met with my old friend Bjorn Lomborg, who some of you may know, who likes to write articles saying Paris will achieve nothing. And the way he concludes that is he looks at all the models and he picks sort of the most extreme one, and then he assumes that, okay, the Paris Accord goes to 2025 and 2030, and after that, we'll just go back to our old ways. So when China says it will peak, actually, it's not going to peak at all. It will just stop for a moment, and then it will go back. Therefore, he concludes the deal isn't very good, missing the entire point. If you go to our website, you'll see every single INDC analyzed, and you'll see an assessment of the sort of dozen most serious models, and it really is going to make a difference. But the assumption is, if it's going to limit world temperature rise to 2.7 degrees, you've heard that number, that does assume that after 2025, 2030, we keep making the same degree of progress. So even the same degree of progress won't get us to the 2 degrees. So the progress has to be ramped up. And that's why, so many that went there, I mean, we were looking for 4 things very specifically, and you were too, I know. One was the 5-year increase in ambition, where, I mean, my goodness me, blood, sweat, and tears went on during those 2 weeks to get that right. And it is right, I think. A second was transparency. It absolutely is essential everybody is transparent, not only because it matters substantively, but because it matters politically. Third, long-term goal. It is absolutely and utterly essential that there is something that says, yes, it's nice that we're doing this up to 2025, 2030, but actually, here's the vision. And it couldn't just be a 2-degree world. It had to say something about decarbonization and moving from something that's absolutely historic. Since the Industrial Revolution, growth has been built overwhelmingly on fossil fuels. This is the century that's going to be radically different, and we're going to move towards an economy that's not based at all on fossil fuels, which is really a remarkable change, and that language was in. And then the fourth thing is adaptation, well, finance in general, but particularly for adaptation. I mean, this was exceedingly important, again, substantively, because like you, we're in the business of worrying about poor people and developing countries. So substantively essential that the resources were adequate, but also politically essential to feed back into the negotiation. So look, this was a remarkable achievement. Something very, very important was going on in Paris and has been going on for the last year, and that is the multi-stakeholder groups that were there, really doing things that again would have been unthinkable. I mean, 400 mayors signing up to the compact of mayors that said not only are we going to be transparent, we're also going to have plans. Those plans are going to be more ambitious than those of our of our national governments. 1,000 companies committing to a price on carbon, 114 major international companies saying we're not only going to have targets, we want you guys to come in and oversee them from a scientific standpoint. They're called science-based targets. And this incredible pivot from we're doing better to we're doing enough. And that's a very important theme that's going on right now, where for the last 20 years, everybody and their dog has been saying, oh, we're doing better. Yeah, but that's not good enough. The question is, are you doing enough? And that's what was happening. So very, very exciting. Also on investors, all these different groups committing. Every single one of them, I think, maybe some exceptions, exceeded their anticipated number of those that would sign up. So look, that's all incredibly positive. Part of this new thing that's happening is that we're learning an enormous amount. I hope Helen will tell us a little bit about what the new climate economy work has shown. But essentially what we're showing is that it is in countries' own interest to move more aggressively. And that is what gives us hope for the future. If we didn't know that, then we would look at the current deal and we'd say, wait a minute, I mean, it's so partial. It's only going to take us for 10 years. What will happen thereafter? What will happen thereafter is that because technologies are coming and because our understanding of economic processes is deepening, the chances of becoming more and more ambitious are rising by the month and by the year. So the question is, why did Prime Minister Modi, who came to power because he wanted economic growth, why did he say, I have 4 gigawatts of solar energy today. My predecessor government said they were going to go to 20 gigawatts by 2022. I'm going to go to 100 gigawatts by 2022. He didn't say that because he's a member of the Sierra Club. He said it because he actually believes that it's good for his economy. He actually believes that this, by making such a dramatic statement, he is doing something non-incremental, and he's sending a signal to investors and his business community, look, there's a whole industry out there. They're going to be factories. You're going to be making lots of money. I'm going to make sure this works, and we are going to bring technology into this country. But he really deeply believes this, or he wouldn't have done it. And so too, we see that in China as well. I have a last comment, then I stop. 2 weeks ago, I had the joy of appearing before a congressional hearing here. The majority has 3 witnesses and the minority has 1. So I was on my own. And a very interesting question came from the majority, a congressman. They said, we've heard that your analysis shows that actually it's in China's interest to peak its emissions by 2030. And I said, yeah. Actually, even if climate change didn't exist, it's good for China to peak because of air pollution and because of economic efficiency and all those things. And I said, actually, it's in the United States' own interest as well to do the Clean Power Plan. It's actually in the United States' own interest. This is incredibly important and gives us great hope that the INDCs will not only be implemented, but will be ratcheted up. Now, I've said all the good news. I hope we're going to pivot now in a pretty big way to implementation. This is going to be extremely difficult. And so organizations like ours, and no doubt yours too, we're really sort of restructuring the way we're thinking about things, whereby we're launching a major program to try and work together with many partners to help countries implement their INDCs and link them, by the way, to the SDGs, because that's very important, and be delighted to talk about that because it's a very, very important transition we all need to go through. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Andrew. That was really impressive. You covered a number of issues, but to see the personal passion as you talk about them, I think really important to signal that some of the key takeaways around the ambitious 5-year increase targets, transparency, long-term thinking, finance, multi-stakeholder engagement, the importance of science-based targets, thinking of the work that has been accomplished around a climate economy, recognizing this sort of self-interest has really become a really motivating factor, and the challenges around implementation. I was really quite intrigued as I looked at the deliberations. I wasn't there, but from afar, on a couple of fronts. One of them is that you specifically spoke about the political, financial, and technical legwork that went into the agreement and the negotiations. And you specifically, in your comments, talk about this moment in time. This is unprecedented. It hasn't happened before. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. Why now? And my second question is somewhat related to that. Coming from an island, myself, I was quite intrigued that the 1.5 degree target was also included. So, you know, and I'm looking at this and saying, well, why? Why now? What really was behind the momentum at this moment in time? What are your thoughts with regard to that?
Well, I think the 1.5 was a huge achievement, and I know it's something that you guys, you know, pushed for a lot. And halfway through, we didn't think it would get it. Some countries that were disappointing in not supporting it, quite frankly. So that's very, very important that that's in. Why now? I think sort of, I don't know, but three reasons. One, I think the politics have changed. I think the moving from the top down, sort of Copenhagen textbook, we're allowed to emit so many tons, we're going to divide them up, and if you don't do, you know, your part of the bargain, we'll send you to prison kind of thing, which wasn't right then. It absolutely would not have worked now. You know, I think, quite frankly, the last 2 years have seen an amazing change on the part, for example, of Europe, where just 2 years ago, when France was really gearing up to do this, I mean, they and the European Union said, this must be a legally binding treaty, and you know, it's not only the United States, but obviously the United States in a very big way, together with China and others, have said, actually, you know, we're going to get more ambition if we do it in a different way. So I think that politics played a big role. Two other things. One, the technology now makes it much more possible, and we never had the mood music from, you know, all these CEOs. I mean, I had the privilege of speaking at an event that, you know, Ban Ki-moon, you know, chaired together with John Kerry and 60 CEOs from around, you know, and we just basically went around the table and said a few words each as to what, it was totally inspiring. These guys get it and believe in it. That would never happen before, and the reason is technology is in a different place, they understand it more, the costs of climate change are clearly greater. The third thing I'd say, and then when Helen talks, she'll say more about this, I think intellectually, we've had a revolution in the last couple of years. We now understand in a way that we didn't before. And Felipe Caldron, who chairs the Global Commission, he says, you know, when I was a young politician, I believed that that it was a trade-off between you know, action on climate change and growth. He said, when I was president, I believed, and in my G20 candidacy, chairmanship, he said, I believed that actually action on climate change was consistent with economic growth. He said, now I believe you can only have economic growth if you take action on climate change. Incredible sort of, for a head of state to talk like that, and I think he's not the only one.
Great, thank you. Politics, technology, and intellect all coming together. So I'm interested in hearing how Paul builds on Andrew's comments. So Paul Bodnar is the Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change at the National Security Council during his tenure at the White House. Now is the Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change. And previously as Director, Bodnar has developed and coordinated the historic US-China climate deal and the $3 billion US pledge to the Green Climate Fund, President Obama's participation in the UN Climate Summit in New York, and previously has served at the State Department as the Director for Climate Finance and Counselor to Special Envoy for Climate Change, Todd Stern, among many other things. So, Paul, what are your thoughts, your perspective from the US government side?
Thanks. And thanks for the opportunity to be here. I think, you know, only a few of us in this room had the privilege of being there on Saturday when Foreign Minister Fabius introduced the Paris Agreement, and then we got to see 2,000 people leap out of their chairs screaming, and it was basically adopted by acclamation. It was an extraordinary moment, a very moving moment. and the end of not 1 year of work and not 7 years of work from our perspective as the administration, but the work of a generation. And I think that, as Andrew said, it really was the best case scenario, and very rarely do you get to a moment like that and feel completely that what the world had been looking for was achieved in this particular meeting. Obviously, it's not the end, it's sort of the end of the beginning, but it is the end of the beginning, we hope. And just like ozone had its Montreal Protocol moment, when countries stopped fighting about that issue as a matter of politics and international relations, we very much hope that Paris will be that moment for climate change. And there's so much hard work ahead, but we hopefully have found a framework in which countries can work going forward systematically, in which markets can be put to work to help us ratchet down our emissions. So let me just offer a few points of perspective from the U.S. government side. I think, as a PhD dropout in international relations, I do know one thing, which is that climate change is one of the toughest problems we've ever had to deal with in international relations. Its complexity, the venue being a consensus-based negotiation, the intergenerational issues. It's been an extraordinarily difficult issue to tackle, and I think from the president's perspective, coming out of Copenhagen and the disappointments of Copenhagen, we've really tried to systematically march towards this moment, and I think we had an agreement in Durban in 2011 to work towards a new agreement that would be applicable to all. But I think at the time, there wasn't that much optimism as to why it would work out. Okay, we were going to try again, but why would it be any different? Why would the result be any different than it was in Copenhagen just 2 years earlier? And from the US perspective, we knew that we needed to root the answer to that question in our domestic credibility. And so with the President's Climate Action Plan in 2013, and especially the Clean Power Plan as the centerpiece of that effort, I think we developed the credibility internationally that allowed us to do, I think the moment that shaped this outcome more than any other perhaps, which was the US-China joint announcement in November 2014. When these two countries, who had been cast as captains of opposing teams in the climate negotiations for so long, stood up together and said, we're going to do this. And that set the scene for, as Andrew said, 188 INDCs and created a lot of momentum for Paris. And in Paris, Paris was an extraordinary meeting. I think for those who have been to COPs, it was one of the smoothest, busiest but smoothest climate meetings to date, and a lot of the credit goes to the French for organizing a very effectively and serving us good food, which the way to one's heart is through one's stomach for sure. But I think also what struck me as someone who's been to a lot of these is the self-discipline that countries displayed. This is a venue where it's easy to grandstand, it's very easy to throw things off the tracks procedurally. It is far easier to make trouble than to make solutions. And I think all countries really restrained themselves and focused eyes on the prize. And that's why we got there. And that's why 4 years after Durban set a deadline of Paris to reach this new agreement, we only missed that deadline by 1 day. So that's a pretty extraordinary outcome.
Fine.
And in terms of the substance, we were concerned going into the meeting that we would need to make trade-offs between our key priorities, which were ambition, durability, so making this not just another stopgap solution like Copenhagen, transparency, and finance. And as Andrew has described, I think the outcome is very strong along each of these dimensions. On ambition, we strengthened the 2-degree goal further. We committed to peak global emissions as soon as possible and to decline quickly thereafter. And we set this new goal of climate neutrality of the global economy by the second half of the century. That is a very clear market signal to investors, to technology innovators, that this is an irreversible process and that we have all agreed to go there as quickly as we can. On the durability of the agreement and the mechanics of how this will work, we got that system of ratcheting every 5 years that we were looking for. It's a one-way ratchet, so each time a country presents a new round of targets, that target needs to be more ambitious than the one that preceded it. And these 5-year ratchets are informed by global stock takes every 5 years of how we're doing. So it's a machine, and we've just turned the first crank with these INDCs, but it's not going to be the last. On transparency, we strengthened the substance of the system, and those of us who worked, Gina McCarthy was there, and she did a lot of good work and has a lot of personal credibility explaining why it's important to use the most recent versions of the IPCC guidelines on inventories and you know, the important nitty-gritty that underpins the strength of the transparency system. So we feel that on transparency, we really raised the playing field while also leveling it across developed and developing countries with some flexibility for those who need flexibility based on their capacity. And on finance, the agreement provides reassurance about continuity going into the post-2020 period, but without making promises that we could not have kept, and while acknowledging that the donor pool is expanding and it will continue to do so. And really importantly, all of this was, as those of you followed this know, kind of wrapped up in a meta-narrative about differentiation of developed and developing countries, and were we going to move forward with the Annex 1, non-Annex 1 system of 2 lists of countries drafted in 1992, or were we going to obliterate that system entirely? I think we achieved a nice balance. Obviously, there is differentiation, recognizing the real differences that exist in country circumstances, but we have moved on, and we have a forward-looking system that's much more flexible, and that we are confident will be relevant in the 2020s and beyond. And finally, I think one other concern we had going in was that we could more or less do all of this, but that we could not, we would only get a minimalist agreement, something where we just did just enough to clear the bar on some of these issues, and then we'd have to punt the rest back into the UNFCCC negotiations in Bonn, where we'd be into the same old arguments. And I think on that dimension, we also collectively did really well. We really nailed down these issues very clearly and unambiguously. So the 31-page agreement, which I'm sure is riveting reading for bedtime stories to children, really does a good job on all of that. So I think as speaking for the administration and speaking personally, we are just so thrilled with this outcome. And you know, I missed my first child's first birthday to be in Paris, and I think it's a fitting monument to his generation. So very happy.
Fantastic. Well done.
Thank you very much, Paul. I know when your son looks back and he says, "Daddy, why did you miss my first birthday?" you have a good answer for him. So I really like your framing. You know, Ozone had its Montreal Protocol moment, and we hope that Paris will be the same for climate change. I think very powerful. I think you paint this idea of being very systematic and establishing domestic credibility. And I like the way that you talk about durability in terms of this machine and what it means, and sort of bringing in the points on ambition, transparency, and finance. I want to ask you something that's a little bit contentious. So, you know, those of us who track issues around loss and damage, we're looking from a developing country perspective at questions around compensation. And I wonder if you could give a little bit of your perspective on those issues coming out of the agreement, loss and damage and compensation for the most vulnerable countries.
Sure. Well, at the beginning of the conference, President Obama was there for 2 days, and he met with President Xi of China. He met with Prime Minister Modi of India, And the third bilateral meeting he did was with the heads of island states, a representative group. And he told them, that he is also an island boy. And
We
they
can
had
relate.
and I think, we recognize, and we have always recognized, the long-term challenges posed by climate change, and that adaptation is the most important thing, but that loss and damage is not a conversation to be avoided. It's something that needs to be talked about and worked on. And in fact, the international community created a whole mechanism for addressing loss and damage under the convention a few years ago in Warsaw. So the debate was really about whether or not loss and damage would have a place in this agreement, and our view was that it should, and that we should not shy away from having these kinds of conversations and working together to deal with long-term irreversible impacts of climate change. It's a reality. But we were also clear that liability and compensation was not something that we could accept as part of this agreement. And that issue, it took a while to work out, but I think that there was quite a high degree of pragmatism in the negotiations on that. And I think what folks wanted more than anything was that this topic be given a clear lane forward to work on. I don't think that liability and compensation, or forcing that conversation, was high on the agenda for many countries. And that's why the agreement contains a provision that makes clear that loss and damage is a topic we'll continue to work on, but that liability and compensation is not part of it.
Great, thank you. So Helen, as we think a little bit about your role at WRI as the Director of Economics and the Program Director for the new Climate Economy Initiative, we know that you're specifically looking at what this means for the climate economy. And I think that we were hearing a little bit earlier about the international companies, this 114 major international companies. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you saw this playing out in the negotiations. What was accomplished? What were the challenges from the point of view of the private sector in the new climate economy?
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Roger Mark. I think there was a lot that happened there, both in advance of and in the lead up to COP21, and also at COP21. And then there's also what actually happens following COP21 with the business sector, with investors. I think one of the major differences of this COP from previous ones was how actively engaged businesses were, investors, subnational governments, whether it was cities or states. It was the mood music that Andrew has referred to, but actually beyond that. I think they were there, they were showing, they were demonstrating to governments and to the public and to the media that ambitious action is not only possible, they are already doing it and they are profiting from it. They are doing it because it's in their own interest and they are benefiting from that. I think this gave, in some ways, and Paul's probably best placed to comment on this, but the impression I had and our Global Commission on Economy and Climate had was that this gave governments the license to actually do more, to be more ambitious, because they were seeing that business and investors were behind or possibly in some cases in front of, taking action and benefiting from it. And it pushed them to do more. We've had clear signals from businesses, from investors in the lead up to COP that they wanted out of that a very strong, clear, long-term policy signal of the direction of the economy. Once they have that, they're able to take action, to make the right investments, to make the right choices. But the worst possible outcome for them would have been uncertainty, lack of clarity on where we're going. And as both Paul and Andrew have said, the clear signal that came out is that we are going towards a decarbonized economy, and we are strongly moving there. 188 countries have signed up to specific targets themselves. We had 2,000 companies and 400 investors that have signed up to specific greenhouse gas reduction goals in the UN Climate Action Platform. So we've had the countries, we've had the companies, we've had the investors doing this. In Paris, we had 27 private billionaires, including Bill Gates, Jack Ma from Alibaba, Mukesh Ambani, who's perhaps the richest man in India, all came forward and together launched the Breakthrough Energy Coalition. Now this is a coalition that is aiming at helping to bring clean energy technologies to market to get over the sort of valley of death between the invention of these technologies and actually getting them to scale in the marketplace. So they've committed themselves to actually start doing this and putting their money behind it to complement what governments are doing. Andrew already mentioned we've got 114 companies that are responsible for about $1 trillion in profits and almost 500 million tons of CO2 who have committed to doing science-based targets in line with 2 degrees or below targets that go that far. Unilever has already come forward and pledged that they will not only be carbon neutral, they will actually be carbon positive by 2030. They will be net absorbing carbon emissions by 2030. And they're doing this because they see it is in their own long-term interests. We've had a number of companies and investors calling for a price on carbon, and countries and states and provinces are starting to listen to them. We also have many who are actually putting in place a carbon price themselves internally. Over 450 now put in place their own carbon price internally to help guide investment decisions. And there's always discussions about what's the right appropriate level of carbon prices. Well, when you look at some of the major oil and gas companies, including ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, and ConocoPhillips, the internal carbon prices they're using are $40 per ton of CO2 emissions or above. So it's actually quite high, higher than many of the carbon prices in markets around the world today. You've also had over 500 institutions that in the lead up to Paris or at Paris have committed to divesting from fossil fuels. And this amounts to over $3.4 trillion in assets under their management. We've had many others who are starting to call for further divestment. The Portfolio Carbon Coalition is a group of investors that are pushing asset owners to commit to decarbonize their portfolios. And we've started to see the benefits of some of these shifts as well. So CDP, Climate Leadership Index, which actually tracks the climate leader, the companies that are climate leaders, has outperformed the Bloomberg World Index of major companies by almost 9%, 9.1% over the last 4 years. So we've seen those who are shifting their investments, we're starting to see that this is actually leading to a positive return. Not in all cases, but there's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of evidence that's starting to build and which is convincing others to take action. We've seen investments are starting to flow in terms of green bonds. These have tripled in the last year alone. And again, in Paris, there is a group of investors, of development banks and others that came together and issued a Paris Green Bond Statement, calling for even more policy action which can help to shift and scale up these investments. And then you take areas like the G20, which is notoriously quite conservative on some of the economic and financial areas. And there, the Financial Stability Board under the G20 has released a report which is actually acknowledging the risks that climate change pose to the financial sector and are calling for and aiming to produce guidance on how best to disclose financial risks, and they're aiming to do that next year. So we're starting to see a shift, and I think what we've seen from businesses, what we've seen from investors is starting to not only provide the license for countries to take more action, but actually pushing them to do so, and to do so hand in hand. The investments we're seeing in innovation from private companies starting to work more closely with what governments are aligning to do. And once we look at those sorts of opportunities and those sorts of pushes, the costs that we've seen coming down in terms of renewable energy opportunities, those are going to continue into the future, perhaps even accelerate. So the opportunities we see today for cost-effective action, we're only going to be seeing more and more in the years ahead.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Helen. So really good to learn that they're already doing it. It's profitable, makes business sense. It's an opportunity for countries, companies, and investors that really came together around Paris, driven by technology, these clean technology investments, science, these science-based targets, and in some cases going beyond just neutrality to be carbon positive, and the importance of having the commitment to decarbonize, but also putting a price on carbon. So the question that I have for you is, in our discussion so far, we have had a strong focus on transparency and accountability coming out of the agreement. How do you see these components of transparency and accountability translating into this private sector space?
I think there's a couple of ways that we've seen, again, some incredible action recently, but also some commitments going forward. One is just in being able to account for the emissions that are taking place at a company level, and there's been some real innovation there in terms of more harmonized and standardized processes and approaches which companies can use, rather than picking and choosing. So there's real opportunities there. I think there's also been a big push from shareholders and stakeholders in companies, and we're seeing this definitely in terms of investors and questions about decarbonizing investments. There's been a big push to understand better what sort of investments are being made in high carbon assets, what the risk is associated with those, what sort of emissions are coming from companies and their activities, what they are doing to reduce those, and what effect those are having. So I think the accountability that businesses and investors are now being held to is just the start of the tip of the iceberg in terms of what shareholders and other stakeholders are going to be asking of them. I think that is a major shift that we're seeing.
Great, thank you. All right, let's. I'm really thrilled that we also have Andrew Light joining us. And Andrew is coming to us from George Mason University, which is wonderful for us because George Mason University is one of our key partners in this Managing Our Planet series. So the Wilson Center, George Mason, and WRI have sort of been the key players in convening this event today. So we're thrilled to have Andrew here from George Mason, and he's a professor of philosophy and public policy and the director of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy at the university. So Andrew, I'm going to ask you to just sort of look forward. What's next? Why is this important? What do you see as some of the long-term implications coming out of the agreement?
Sure, thank you. And just one brief caveat at the top, I am speaking only in my capacity today as a member of the faculty at George Mason. And in that regard, I want to echo Tom Lovejoy's welcome at the top of this. Mason has actually come quite a long way in a short amount of time with respect to our capacity on climate change, and it's really become, I've had a lot of different academic jobs, and I have to say that it's got one of the best collections now of people working in this area across a range of areas from science, with one of the, I believe, and Jagadish Shukla, who's here, can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we now have the biggest collection of climate modelers of any academic institution in the United States. Once Shukla and his colleague Jim Kinter's center was moved onto our campus, many of you know the Climate Change in the American Mind series that our colleague Ed Maybach edits out of our Center for Climate Change Communication. There's obviously Tom's work on biodiversity, the great work that we do in the School of Public Policy as well with some of my colleagues who are here on that. And our president, Angel Cabrera, this is a central concern of his, and it's been wonderful to sort of be part of the early growth of the institution in that respect. I would want to say there's not a whole lot I can add to the three presentations here in terms of what happened in Paris and all. I will say one thing about what I think from a sort of a more kind of scholarly perspective on what I think is why one of the reasons we should probably value the outcome, and then turn to the question of sort of where do we go from here and what are the larger implications of this, I think, with respect to diplomacy. I think there's less of this now, especially after the success of Paris, but certainly in my experience going back 15 years working on climate policy, and I was an early advocate, especially when I was at the Center for American Progress, working with John Podesta during the first term of the Obama administration, of really trying to use our first opening in Copenhagen to try to build a new architecture, right, for an agreement. And it was, I think, very much so in 2008, 2009, it was a minority view that we really wanted to move in the direction that we wound up moving in, which is a more bottom-up kind of architecture for a climate agreement. I mean, I think the legacy of this process going back to 1992 was a lot of remorse that Kyoto never got the traction that many people think it should have, what role the United States played in that, and these kinds of things. You know, that the ideal Kyoto looks very much like what we would imagine an international agreement should look like, top down. There are targets that are set, there are timelines for them, they're common to certain parties, not all parties, and then there's an implementation mechanism and provisions for what happens if a party doesn't meet its targets. So really, I think that those of us who sort of saw that as that the way forward to a truly global climate agreement, which would in fact be adequate, and not only adequate, but actually much more step up to the plate for what we really needed, which was to get at least all of the major emitters, no matter where they were in the world, to step up and make some kind of contribution. Didn't have to be the same, but to make a contribution towards a common goal. The way we were going to get there was not going to be through a revision of the same kind of process that we went through with Kyoto, but had to be something different. And so we saw the first round of this kind of happening with respect to the pledges that were put forward in 2010 coming out of the Copenhagen conference, and those are the kind of more or less cover most of the emission pledges out to 2020. And then with the 188 now INDCs, we see really the fruition of really the refinement of that architecture, an architecture for a climate agreement that doesn't look like Kyoto, looks more like the Copenhagen kind of approach, bottom-up pledges, but with a lot more, importantly a lot more, and all of the elements that especially Andrew and Paul have pointed to, the 5-year cycles, the common transparency provisions, the long-term goal, all of this kind of stuff which is the international binding part, right, of this agreement. All of that is going to be critical moving forward. Climate change is not the only area of international diplomacy where we see this kind of bottom-up agreement. Certainly, though, it is, I think, the most important in terms of its scope. And this is going to be a real test of not just this agreement as such with respect to what it does for climate change, but whether this kind of architecture moving forward in international diplomacy really will work. And then we can start imagining what else it could work on. If you think, though, about if you were, I wasn't there, but if you were in Rio in 1992 and you're right there at the launch, right, of the Framework Convention, unlike some of my students, I was alive in 1992. I just wasn't, happened to be in Rio. I was still in graduate school. And so if you think about what you would have wanted to see, right, if you just kind of had a moment where you kind of thought through the realm of possibilities, what would you want to see when we really got to an agreement that really would live up to the legacy of the creation of the Framework Convention? It would look something like this, right? Maybe we wouldn't have foreseen that it would be based in something like the INDCs are structured, but we certainly would want this collection of parties to be at the table, and as Paul pointed out, as early as they were, willing to say, starting with the United States and China, coming forward, the two top emitters in the world, coming forward and saying, we're ready to show ambition. And not only that announcement from November 2014, but I also think of really just equally as important, although often overlooked, is the second kind of big US-China announcement that happened last September, when the Chinese come here, announce that they're putting forward, right, their own climate finance pledge through their South-South fund, that they are going to start a cap-and-trade system, a national cap-and-trade system to be implemented by 2017, I believe, right? And they choose to announce it not in Beijing and not in New York, even that close to the opening of UNGA, but here in Washington. And that, I think, is a testament to what many of us saw as what we wanted to come out of this process, which is a competition among the parties to see who can outshine the other, who can move forward. And moving forward, what is going to be most important is whether or not that competition continues. And on these regular 5-year cycles, do we see, right, a continuation of this effort to move forward, outdo each other, push each other to do more, see who best takes the opportunities, right, to do more. And that's where I think that one thing that wasn't mentioned that came out of this agreement, equally important, is not just the cycles of the INDCs, but also there's a global stocktake that's built into this process. So just before you put down and are putting down your new INDCs, you're going to go through a stocktake period, which will be comprehensive, looking at everything, mitigation, adaptation, everything, really looking at the world as it is to help you prepare your next INDC, but equally importantly, to look at what are the opportunities out there. So the example of the sort of the consortium of the the investors led by Bill Gates, who put together their breakthrough. I was
Energy
breakthrough.
Coalition.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So Breakthrough Energy Coalition, which was attached to Mission Innovation, right? Which Paul, I know, worked very hard on, which is this commitment by 20 countries around the world to double their research and development budgets on clean technology over the next 5 years. Those parties represent, I think it's in the range of 80% of global R&D investment at this point. And that group of parties, along with those investors, and along with many of the other things were also announced on the first day of the COP, such as the new International Solar Alliance that was led by the Indian government, those are the kinds of things that can help us to get through to the breakthroughs on technology that we need to really see our way towards the kind of longer term goals that are outlined in the agreement. And what we need the cycle of stock take and INDCs for is to not only pop our heads up to sort of see, all right, it's not just an exercise of who can dig deeper, but who will best recognize the opportunities in front of them that will hopefully be driven by that kind of innovation, that real strengthening of innovation that we're seeing clean tech innovation coming out of this. And it won't just be the innovation side, it'll be the business models built around that, which our President Angel Cabrera is quite interested in at Mason, but also the innovations that we're going to see in adaptation, in responses, and like all the other kinds of things is there. So that's kind of one big point, I think, in terms of how really this is a great, I think, culmination to a 21-year process of trying to figure out what is a kind of agreement that actually gets us to realistically take advantage of the opportunities that we will now be creating for ourselves. The only other thing I want to mention is one other point, is that I've seen this trend happening for, I really want to say it started in 2010. It's be a longer story and I won't go into this, when we kind of finished the unfinished business of Copenhagen and Cancun, and where the Mexicans hosts were, I think that when the many histories will be written of the climate diplomacy process, which I'm sure Paul will be page turners too, but those the brilliant diplomacy of the French this time around, the brilliant diplomacy of the Mexicans in 2010, when we were really facing a very crisis moment in this whole process, when, given the way Copenhagen ended with 5 parties, blocking consensus, we really needed a win there, and they did so well. But I think starting in 2010, I've seen this increasing trend that will also get us forward and move forward with respect to what we need to do, and that is breaking climate diplomacy out of the silo, right, that it's historically been in. I remember when I first got to, one of my first years in Washington, it might have been 2010 or something, and it was, I think then, I went to a meeting sponsored by the White House, and this is our former colleague Trevor Hauser was working on China in Todd Stern's office, and it was a readout of the outcome of the U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue, which is an annual, sort of our big, high annual comprehensive diplomacy event. And it was sort of, 10 experts on China, mostly strategic and economic issues, and then Trevor was there representing climate stuff, and was like an hour-and-a-half meeting or something like that, and all the China experts in Washington were in the room. And there was we went all that time, and there was not a single question on climate change, on what these two parties were working on climate change. Now you can't imagine a group of scholars meeting on U.S.-China relations and ignoring what we're doing on climate change. And it's not just to make China the exception, it's just a good example of that, where I think that we have entered a period now where, and this connects with my earlier point on what we hoped this kind of structure of an agreement would do with respect to parties trying to outcompete each other in terms of doing more, and then also looking for the opportunities on technology. But we will see, I think, that this is going to be, and already is, a sign truly of one's international credibility writ large, what you are doing on this issue. And we're going to know, again, in these regular cycles, there will be an opportunity to check in and look at that and see what a party is willing to do. That will mean that we will see much more of, I believe, parties looking at their climate obligations not in a vacuum, but in terms of their larger cooperation on security, economic cooperation, human rights, like everything else. It's going to be one of those things where we're looking not just about what do we trade within the text, right, on a sort of a climate win, but what is it overall that's going to, that we want to sort of, or what levers can we use, what carrots can we use across the entire range of our relationships with other parties, either in smaller multilateral fora or in bilaterally, which can be used to drive and encourage more ambition on climate change. And that, I think, is going to be, that is really what we need. If climate change truly does represent the moral challenge, right, one of the biggest moral challenges of our time, one of the most important areas that countries can work together towards, if that is all true, everyone who said that, Secretary Kerry, you know, President Obama, this has really been a lot of the message of this in the last couple years. If that is true, then that is the appropriate place where climate sort of meets these other areas of international cooperation on an equal footing. And I think that is going to drive a lot, right, of the conversation kind of moving forward at that higher level as well. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andrew. As I reflect on your comments, I very much appreciate this rethinking of the global architecture. You talk about this top-down target, timelines, what's not common to all implementation mechanisms, that the provisions are not met in the degree to which the climate agreement represents a new global architecture for us to be looking at. I think a very important point about vision, you know, sort of looking back to what we would have liked to have seen by now and to recognize that we've made some progress in getting there. I think also important points around climate diplomacy and sort of the different vagaries and challenges that we have faced in the community. And then finally getting to implementation, competition, and international credibility, seeing how those play out in these 5-year increments as we move forward. So the question that I have for you is, I wonder if you have heard any criticisms of the agreement, or where you suspect folks may be critical of what has come out of Paris, and are there areas where you agree, and are there areas where you say, you know what, I really disagree, this really is different? Is that a fair question?
Yes, it's a very fair question. Some issues you've actually already raised, I think, of some concerns that folks have had, and we've heard some answers on them. The biggest one, and this was a story that was being written, I think, with too much frequently going back a couple years now, which was really sort of, it's a headline, right? You know, countries agree to international climate agreement that cannot meet its own targets, right? And mostly people focus on the 2 degrees Celsius target, and of course now with the sort of the much more forward-leaning language on pursuing efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5, there will be more of that. So, you know, one of the answers that's been out there has been this pretty impressive analysis that was done when this was sort of shortly after October 1st, which was the deadline for getting in INDCs, so that the Secretariat could produce this report, right, on the cumulative ambition of all of them prior to Paris, that we saw this big drop from, I think it was 3.6 or 3.8. This was on the carbon tracker analysis, down to 2.7, right, when you looked at sort of what the trajectory was in terms of global temperature. And then now that that was when we were sort of aiming at 2, and if we're really aiming at 1.5, well then that sort of makes it 1.2, and so suddenly like we're sort of off, we keep moving the goalposts literally. So, and Andrew answered this in part at the beginning, it's probably a problem we couldn't really have avoided for ourselves. These things are confusing. When in 2009, when the parties first started articulating 2 degrees Celsius officially, right, as our target, if that's our target, if that's our sort of functional definition, right, of what we're trying to achieve with these kinds of agreements, of course you're going to look at the outcome and kind of go, how much does it add up to that number? But of course the architecture for this agreement is not one where you would at all expect to be adding up to 2 degrees on your first go round in your INDCs. I mean, that's just not the point of it. If we had asked parties to come forward and put forward a target that could potentially be long enough out so that you could sort of add up where it would be with respect to the 2 degree target. So we sort of said, all right, everyone come up and you know, your INDC should be your 2050 target as opposed to your 2025 or your 2030 target. It would have been meaningless, really. Because either parties would, you know, would sort of like shoot the moon without really any much of a sort of a plan for how they were going to achieve some dramatic increase in 2050, or they would have totally lowballed it. And so you wouldn't have an agreement that actually could really show us progress along the way. So if what we're aiming for is that the first targets were to, in the US case it's 2025, many other large emitters it's 2030, Brazil has a hybrid one, right, 2025 and 2030. With that kind of architecture, then you're not going to put the pledges on the table that are going to get to 2 degrees right away, just given how the physical reality, right, of how carbon dioxide moves through the system and other greenhouse gases. It's going to become through this ratcheting up process over time. And so I think that is the biggest thing, is it's been difficult for people to grasp. Well, I don't understand. Isn't the only test, right, of success of whether or not you hit the marker that you laid out there for yourself, yes and no, right? It is an appropriate measure of success. It is now in Article 2 as the first objective of this agreement, but the totality of the process that we're setting up, the platform that we're setting up, should be, is in fact what will be the true test of whether it does that once we get through successive, you know, iterations of INDCs going out to mid-century, really. And that's when you're going to start to see whether or not it is appropriate to those goals. And that means, again, what we talked about before, whether or not we're not just involved in a kind of an academic exercise of kind of looking at where we are and tweaking it a bit, but whether or not we are racing to the top. Right.
Great. I'm going to ask you all to comment on that question, then we'll open it up to you for your questions. So, Helen, do you agree?
I do. I think what we have in the agreement and what came out of Paris is an excellent start towards trying to keep emissions on a trajectory which will keep global warming below 2 degrees, hopefully towards 1.5. It's a good start. It's not enough, but the architecture of reviewing how progress is made, coming back in 5 years to ratchet up, not ratchet down, not say the same, ratchet up ambition is the essential bit. And let me just give a couple of reasons why I think this actually provides us with a lot of hope here. When you look back over the years, the last 5, 10, 15 years of projections of what might be possible in the renewable industry, even the very best minds who understood energy systems got it completely wrong. So if you look back at, for example, the International Energy Agency, the best projections out there on where energy is going to go to, if you look back at what they said in 2007 in terms of renewables potential for what they were projecting for 2030, we've already passed it. So what they thought was possible in 2030, we've passed it well beyond before 2014. So I mean, what we've learned in 5, 10 years, we've had renewables, the cost of renewable solar photovoltaics, the components, the costs have come down by 80% in just 4 years. What we've been able to do in terms of battery and storage technologies, what we're able to do in terms of integrating into the grid, none of this could have been foreseen by even the best in the field 5, 10 years ago. So by being able to come back, by committing as governments to come back in 5 years, they will have the opportunity to see what further progress has been made, to learn from the experiences, and to be able to ratchet up ambition. The technology is one where there's huge potential, and as we've heard, both from the governments and companies are investing more. Another area that I think is particularly important is in terms of lessons from policy application. You know, if you talked 5, 10 years ago about carbon pricing, people would look at you and say, yes, that's what the Europeans are doing. It's a little bit suspicious. We'll wait and see what happens. We now have 40 countries around the world who are applying carbon pricing. We have 23 subnational governments, provinces, states, cities who are doing so. As you mentioned, China is going to a national carbon pricing scheme in 2017. But we're starting to see the evidence of what's happened through those carbon pricing schemes. And what we're seeing again and again is that they've not only helped to reduce emissions, but the countries or provinces, states that have applied them have actually had good economic growth. They've been able to manage the transition smoothly for affected industries. The fears that these would be negatively impacting low-income households have not materialized. They've actually been good for growth and good for climate action. So we're starting to see the results of these. The more we see those, the more that other countries will be able to take action. We'll have comfort. We'll know what can be done, how to do it, what some of the lessons are, for example, from fossil fuel subsidy reform, and how to move that forward. So there's more and more evidence from the policy side, there's more from the technology, and that's going to put us in a different world. So I have great hope that in 5 years' time, as countries come back, they will be able to actually ratchet up ambition.
Okay, Paul, any criticisms you are anticipating and getting ready to position yourself to respond to those criticisms?
You know, I think those who follow this process understand just how big of a milestone this is, and those who are not convinced that we should be acting on climate change, I think when you see every other country in the world moving forward with such momentum and conviction, it's a little harder to say, well, there's some magical reason why we shouldn't and we can't. If you see that there is a clean energy revolution underway, then you start to think, well, I don't want to be behind the curve on that. So, and of course, when an agreement like this sinks in and it starts to be implemented like a regulation domestically, it starts to be built into the baseline of the normal. And companies build around it, citizens, mayors. And I do think that what Andrew was saying at the beginning, that for many years this whole debate was about governments, national governments, and it was kind of this two-dimensional debate. And what's happened in the last couple of years is this third dimension's popped out, which is the multi-stakeholder dimension. And when you're able to walk into the climate negotiations with 150 blue-chip American companies of various stripes and political tendencies supporting climate action, when you have 27 billionaires from all over the world, when you have Pope Francis and religious organizations, you're in a new world. And I think it's that third dimension which also provides, and the compact of mayors and so on. You're in a new world, and that third dimension provides the buttressing that I think we'll have for national commitments.
So, Andrew, I wanted to ask you a slightly different question. So, sort of building on, the way that we may envision criticisms of the agreement, what could we in the environment community be doing better to ensure that the promise of Paris is realized? Where are we in the environment community getting in the way? What do we need to do better?
Wow. That is a different
Small
question.
question.
Well, look, first, we do have to be honest. In this immediate sort of afterglow, we rightly rejoice because this is, I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, this is absolutely historic, game-changing. It's going to set the course really for this century of the world economy. I mean, quite frankly, I mean, the transition is huge. And so we absolutely should be, but at the same time, I mean, look, there are, whilst every country, well, almost every country will benefit out of this transition. Not all, there will be some that are totally dependent on fossil fuel, but most countries like the United States, China, India, the big countries, Europe, will benefit from this. That doesn't mean that everybody will benefit, and it doesn't mean that every company will benefit or every industry will benefit. And I think we need to be very, very sort of open and honest about that. And going on at the moment, of course there are criticisms. This is, as everyone, especially Andrew, though, said, this is not your grandfather's climate deal. In that regard, the only thing I slightly disagree with you, Andrew, on, when you said, when we sat in Rio, and you're too young a man to have been there, but those of us that sat in Rio, actually we wouldn't have envisaged this. We would have envisaged what was hoped for in the Copenhagen one, which is, how much can you emit? What's the total stock? What's the optimal trajectory to get there? Divide it up, and an enforceable deal. Now that then, sort of, and by the way, money to compensate poor countries. In those days, a phrase that's never used nowadays is incremental cost. Incremental cost drove the Global Environment Facilities creation, which was the same time. In other words, the view was, it costs more to do that, and that's because it did. It did back then. And so there were thousands of calculations on an incremental cost, and that's when we pioneered the marginal abatement cost curve. If you go back to the WDR 1992 that the World Bank wrote, I happen to be the chief author of, you'll actually see a marginal abatement cost, because the idea was you could do a certain amount, but then you were going to have to get into that higher part. So we're now in a much, much messier situation that is a better situation, because we're flirting with real parity. And so if I thought that technology was not going to improve, I would be quite pessimistic, be absolutely honest. I know technology is going to improve because history shows cost curves are keeping going down, and history shows discontinuities abound. And so I think that we need to be really open. The criticisms are, this is not legally binding. The criticisms are, you can show models that if you stop trying in 2025, obviously you're not there. The criticisms include, will the United States actually be able to deliver the $3 billion it's promised to the Green Climate Fund? I think we've got to be very honest about these criticisms, and would that in turn undermine, the spirit of esprit de corps? So I think we need to face up to them, and we need to address them. But the most important thing is moving forward is on January the 1st, there'll be 3 groups of countries, all of whom have written INDCs. Group 1 will be those who say, great, now let's get on with it. How should we do it? So that group of countries actually is asking for all kinds of interesting technical analysis. The mistake we'd make in the environmental community and the international development community would be everyone and their brother comes in offering this, that, we've got a technique to do this, that, and the other, and it'll be this cacophony of, and we need to be pretty disciplined about this is complicated stuff, and you need to have an offer that is really clear if you want to help these countries. There's a second group of countries that some of the ministers will say, yeah, let's get on with it. Other ministers will say, are you nuts? I mean, what were you smoking there in Paris? I mean, so there absolutely won't be, but there will be champions, and there'll be those who go. And that's where some pretty smart diplomacy, that's where, we really need the kind of diplomacy that the United States and others bring, and I'm looking at the Norwegians down here on the front row. I mean, we've got some real champions here that are awfully good at this kind of stuff. We need some pretty disciplined political diagnosis. Now, there'll be a third group of countries that basically will say, well, been there, done that, now let's move on to something else. And quite frankly, there won't be cabinet meetings where this is on the agenda. Maybe the Minister of Environment will sort of monitor it, and you go to Marrakesh next year to the next COP. But quite frankly, within the government, there'll be no buzz whatsoever. There'll be no discussion. Now, that group of countries needs something a little bit different. They need to be reminded that actually, guys, you signed up to this, and this is serious business, and so we are going to hold you accountable. And that requires a different kind of thing. That requires role at the United Nations. It requires civil society to get very well organized and really engaged, because nobody, I don't care, rich or poor, when you sign up to something and say, we're wanting to do this, there has to be some obligation. So I think we need a pretty serious diagnosis as we head into the next stage.
Okay, excellent. Andrew, did you want to add something?
Well, I think I was unclear in my comments earlier. Surely in 1992 you wouldn't have seen an architecture like this. Yeah. I think this is sort of a new one for diplomacy across the board. It's been long in coming. But what you would have wanted to see was these people around, these
exactly.
Everyone
yes, absolutely
participate.
That would have been a
It's
dream.
not just like the big emitters,
Yeah.
which I mentioned before, but it's the companies, right? It's the subnational, it's the states, it's the provinces. It's like this amazing community and civil society,
Yeah.
right? Everyone participating in some way. The way the French sort of designed what we call Pillar 4, right? So to sort of give institutions like yours and ours and states and provinces the ability to, and cities to come forward and make their own pledges. Like that would be your optimal.
Yeah.
If you really took the problem seriously,
Right.
and you were a technological optimist,
Yeah.
right, in 1992, and you saw that, okay, this is going to get better. It won't just be, the dismal science, right, of sort of figuring out, how much is this going to cost for whom first, that there really was going to be an opportunity into it, then you would have wanted something that would pull all of these folks together, and that is what we did achieve. And that's what we've got right now. Now the question is, how do you sort of keep that momentum moving forward? And that's where I have to say that one of the reasons I've taken so many students over the years to the COPs is because of if you haven't been to one of these things, there's the formal negotiations, right? And the people sitting in rooms and looking at text and, doing red lines and putting in brackets and all that kind of stuff. There is the vast, though, number of booths, right? It is a bazaar, not bizarre, but bazaar, right? Of the best ideas on the solution side you could ever possibly imagine in every conceivable, chunk of this that you want to take on, whether it's sinks in the land sector, right? Whether it's the clean energy side, whether it's the business model side, right? Whether it's sort of the scientists like figuring out new ways that they can sort of understand what's going on, regardless of what parties are willing to sort of report on themselves. All this kind of stuff, it's like you just go through these meetings, and it's tens of thousands of people who all are there in their own way representing tens if not hundreds of thousands of more people back home who are doing all this kind of work. And that is, if the problem, again, it's really as important as we say it is at the very highest levels, then that is what you need, is you need to create a kind of a climate economy, right, which is this, which, when you take students there, they can imagine that they can have a life, right, doing one part of it, whatever makes them most excited. And that, I think, really is, that the fact that that's grown up along with these negotiations, the formal negotiations, is, I think, a testimony to the success of this process as much as I think anything else is.
Excellent. But I'm really glad that we were able to bring in the civil society piece and sort of the youth student sort of. Let's open it up. I have colleagues who will come to you. I'll take multiple questions at the same time. Please give your name and your affiliation and get quickly to your question so we can take as many of them as possible. So we'll start with the gentleman at the back.
Hello, I'm Tim Mealy with Meridian Institute. My question's for Paul. And agree totally with all the points about the remarkable diplomacy that led to this agreement. I'm really curious to know a little bit more from the inside perspective about the shall that should be should, and the degree to which U.S. diplomats have convinced not only the French, but also many other people around the world about the delicate situation that the Obama administration is in with regard to Congress, and the degree to which we've come back now with an agreement that apparently need not be ratified by the Senate. So I wonder if you could just comment a little bit about, you kind of seem to have alluded to that a bit in your remarks, so I just wonder, in response to the question from Roger Mark, if you could elaborate a little bit more about what you see happening in the halls of Congress in the next period of time.
Great, thank you. Additional questions? Yes. Gentleman right here, please. Yes? Microphone is coming to you.
In addition to Congress, we also
If you can have your name and affiliation.
Myron Beckenstein, University of Maryland. In addition to the situation in Congress, where not believing in climate change is sort of a matter of policy, of identity for the leaders, we have Republican candidates for president who also don't believe in it. They've not been asked about it in any of the debates, and that's, I assume, because all of them agree that there's nothing there. If the U.S. opts out of this, what is this going to mean for the accord?
Great, thank you. Yes, we'll take a couple of questions up front.
Hi, Stuart Sarkozy-Bonacy from Pre-Carvery Labs, and representing a group of folks that are working on the Island Resilience Initiative. You mentioned President Obama saying he was an island boy, and the United States also being part of that group that the Marshall Islands was leading. And I think my question is mostly for Paul, but it's also for others in the room, including our friends, the Norwegians. How do we move to action to really put something behind these efforts not just from the what's written on paper, but how do we move to something like the Island Resilience Initiative and working for those pieces of the language that do affect the island nations, coastlines, and some of the indigenous and other pieces that got in.
Yeah, thank you. Yes?
I'm John Strand. I'm from the World Bank, and I'm also maybe the Norwegian that Andrew referred to, a previous colleague of Andrew. I have a couple of comments here, which I think this is obviously a big landmark, but I think now the hard work is starting, because the issue here, to a large extent, is it possible to make these countries just adjust the policies so as to accommodate this development? Because I've talked to people with the hedge funds that specialize on environmental issues and renewables, and they say, if you have a country that's subsidizing fossil fuels, the country is out. It's not relevant, because they know that that country is not going to be interesting for investments of that type. And here the issue is, are the countries willing to adopt the carbon prices and real prices that are going to make these developments possible? So that's sort of, I think, one key issue going ahead. The other key issue has to do with finance. Now this $100 billion promised in Copenhagen have been pushed out in time, but the raising of that money as fresh seed money, I think it has to be raised as seed money, is still not clear. So it's probably maybe coming along, hopefully, but it's far from clear.
Great, thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, Brianna Mobby from the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. Mary Robinson, the UN envoy for climate change, spoke last week saying that the conference is largely dominated by men and would in turn reflect men's vision for the next few years. So I was wondering what you think about that statement, and if you could talk more about the debates surrounding human rights and gender language in the agreement.
Thank you. Yes, we'll take a couple more at the back, and then we'll come.
Hi, Moses Jackson, Forest Service contractor. I was wondering if you could speak more to what this agreement means for the land sector specifically. We didn't touch on that much. Obviously, emissions from forest loss contribute a huge portion of global emissions, but they're often sort of marginalized in lots of these discussions. Forests are recognized in Article 5 of the agreement, but I wondered if the panelists had additional thoughts on what it might mean moving forward, particularly in tropical developing country contexts.
Thank you. And yes, we'll take one more at the back, and then we'll...
Thank you so much. My name is Rita Jerona Adkins. I'm a journalist. I'm curious about the clamor in the developing countries that for their governments to pledge, and which they did, to the agreement that was reached in Paris, that they would also contribute to combating climate change at their national as well as at the global level, but not at the expense of their development and poverty reduction thing. Now, there's money that has been sort of committed at large to something like about 100 billion a year to 500 billion for the next 5 years, precisely for, at the global level, to pursue, to be able to achieve the gains. But how do you sort of kind of get the pressure going so that the money that would be going to combat climate change at the developing countries would also seriously be in the context of their poverty reduction and development projects?
Thank you. So a short list of questions. Shall or should U.S. diplomacy? What does it mean for Obama and Congress? What happens to the deal if the U.S. is out of the picture? How do we really move to action for islands? Is it possible for countries to really adjust their policies when you think of arrangements with regard to fossil fuels? Where are we on financing? Are we able to really raise fresh seed money? Where are the women? Where's the gender perspective and human rights? What's happening with the land sector? What are the implications, particularly for tropical countries? And what does it mean in terms of potentially support under the agreement at the national and global level, pulling money away from poverty alleviation programs or programming? So who would like to start? Paul's smiling, so we'll have you start, Paul.
Okay, thanks. Well, the shall versus should, that was an interesting episode, which delayed the end of the whole thing by a couple of hours. It was a quite unfortunate clerical error to make, given the importance of that word. And the version that I have of the agreement, printed on A4 paper, which means it'll stick out of my binder for the rest of time, is the pre-correction version. So it's like having, you know, the stamp with the airplane upside down on it. Maybe very valuable one day. But you know, that was a quite straightforward, if unfortunate, episode, because when you come to a final version of a document in a 2-week negotiation, you have the whole negotiating history of how you got there. And one of the things the French did really well is that they managed it in a very transparent and orderly way. So you could track the progression of negotiating issues all throughout the 2 weeks through multiple iterations of text. And on this particular matter, each of those iterations had the word should, and then it was flipped in this last version.
You might just explain to everyone. Not everyone will know the shall
Yeah.
and should thing.
So this is an issue about. I was coming to that.
It's just accountability, transparency.
You should come to it.
I
Or you
shall-
shall come to it.
You shall.
It was just
I'll
a
come to
random
it now. So you know, in legal international agreement language, shall implies a legally binding requirement for whatever is said in that sentence, and should does not. And you know, we have long been for an agreement that has legally binding provisions, but we have not supported an agreement that has legally binding targets or new legally binding financial commitments. And we're not alone, by the way, in preferring an agreement that did not have legally binding targets. There are a number of other countries, the major developing countries, who also had that position. And so in the interests of having an inclusive agreement, and also, frankly, learning the lessons of the Kyoto Protocol, both politically and otherwise, that was the structure that we supported, and that is the outcome. The outcome does not require advice and consent by the Senate. And the shall should in that particular article, Article 4.4 of the agreement, caused some issues in that regard. But it was resolved. The French presented it as they should, as an error born of a secretariat that had been stretched to the limit for 2 weeks, and there were a number of other errors that were read out in that final plenary, and it was fixed. But look, I think when you look at, I believe that this agreement will endure, and I think it will endure to future administrations. It will endure because it's precisely a deal that has learned the lessons and the bipartisan feedback of previous rounds, right? And if you look at the criticisms of Kyoto and some of the criticisms of Copenhagen, this is an agreement that puts all major economies on a level playing field. It has very strong transparency provisions. It features targets set by countries, not negotiated and imposed top-down. It has all the features of an international agreement that for which there has been a fair degree of bipartisan support. And what underpins it politically is an extremely strong show of commitment from China. And that was baked into it from the beginning. And as Andrew said, to have China come to Washington and announce cap and trade here years after cap and trade failed in the United States is a powerful display that the United States is not going it alone, and in fact that others are going to move forward on this path to the clean energy economy, and we better be out in front. So I think that I'm quite confident that it will endure. Just to address the financing issue and the islands issue for a moment. So there is climate finance flowing today, and I think one of the things we accomplished this year was a report that was actually not produced by countries but by the OECD, whom Helen used to be a leading staffer at, which showed that as of 2014, climate finance towards the 100 billion stood at about $62 billion per year. So 62 billion in 2014, which was about 10 billion higher than in 2013. And if you think about that trajectory out to 2020, and you add all these announcements that have been made in recent months by countries, by the World Bank, the other development banks, we're comfortably on our way to meeting the $100 billion goal. And I think that report, as much as it caused acrimony and the usual stir in the negotiations, if you look at what happened in the parts of the text that related to these issues, it was a pretty quiet landing. And I think it really built a lot of credibility along the way. Now, there's a lot of work left to do, and in particular on adaptation, and in particular for islands. And one of the things that did not make it into the text, which we had advocated for, was the notion that countries who are donors and who provide international development assistance should not just treat adaptation as a pot of money over here that's totally separated from development assistance, but rather do what a number of countries have done, started doing, including the United States, which is to factor in climate risk and think about climate risk in the context of every development investment that's made, and think about whether that investment has been done with climate impacts in mind and what would need to be done to that investment, and to make adjustments that are necessary to make that investment climate resilient. So this idea of mainstreaming climate into development assistance and development finance is really, really important. But again, that's not enough. And we announced that we're doubling our grant-based assistance for adaptation. Secretary Kerry announced that in Paris by 2020. And we're trying out interesting new financial technologies around risk pools. But it's a huge effort that needs to be made. And I think while we understand mitigation quite well, and we understand how you reduce emissions and how you build wind farms and solar plants and so on, adaptation finance is much less well understood. And I think if you're interested in working in this area in the next 5 years or so, that's one of the most interesting to work on.
Well said.
What if the U.S. opts out?
We're not going to opt out.
Okay.
We helped design this thing.
All right.
We designed it for our national circumstances, or with those in mind, and I think the U.S. is going to be a strong pillar of this agreement going forward.
Okay. Helen, your thoughts?
Yeah, a couple of comments in response to the question. Some very, very good questions and ideas there. One I wanted to talk about a little bit is the land use sector, which is incredibly important. And when you look at emissions today, about a quarter of the emissions today are from deforestation, from degraded lands, whether it's agriculture or forest lands, and from food loss and waste. So there's a huge opportunity there. There's also a real challenge. These are not easy areas. In energy, in some ways, it's a little bit clearer cut. You say fossil fuels, you've got clean energy, you've got energy efficiency. This is more challenging, but it is something which countries and companies and civil society and others are grappling with. A number of the INDCs did include explicitly, particularly from tropical forest countries, explicitly included what they're planning to do on this. We are looking at where there are opportunities for both economic benefits and climate action, whether it's in reducing deforestation, and Brazil's had some real successes there, which are quite exciting to learn from, or it's in other areas. And one example here is degraded agricultural lands. Right now, about 25% of agricultural lands worldwide are classified as extremely degraded. That means they are not producing the crops they should to help feed us for food security. They are not producing the incomes for farmers in rural communities, and they are leading to soil loss and loss of carbon, enormous losses there, environmental degradation. So actually putting in place some of the mechanisms, some of the tools which can help to reduce degraded lands, to reinvigorate these lands, can help contribute to growth, to incomes, to better food security, and also climate action. So there's real opportunities there. There's also been enormous progress, including in Paris, in terms of some of the countries that are willing to work together with tropical forest countries, and Norway is one, UK, Germany, the major development banks, to actually provide some of the funding and the finance to help make this happen in the capacity building. So I think it's an international effort. It does not get the coverage and press attention as energy or transport, for example, but it's a major important area, and there are those who are really working to see solutions. A couple of other points. John Strand mentioned that, this was a landmark, and I have to say, all this year we've been saying 2015 is the big year. We've got the Sustainable Development Goals, we've got COP21. Partway through COP21, we were like, actually, 2016 is the big year. Implementing all of this, waking up in January and seeing how you implement it, it's not going to be easy. There's a huge amount of opportunities, there's a lot of commitment and momentum, but we need to capitalize on that and get it going in the right direction. I do think what we've seen in terms of business and investors, I highlighted those who are really the leaders and moving ahead. There's many others who aren't yet there, aren't yet convinced, don't know what to do or whether they should. But the leaders are moving ahead, and I think when you start to look at some of the market reactions following COP21, coal stocks plummeted the prices. It was a clear market signal. We're moving away. That's not something we can continue with. I think you are starting to see some of that shifting. One other point I wanted to address was gender balance. As the woman on this panel, I think our audience is more balanced. It is true when you look at the negotiators, I think, when you look at the world leaders, certainly there's not necessarily the gender balance that we would want to see. But one thing I do want to give credit to in the COP21 outcomes is two incredibly fantastic women whose drive and energy really helped to lead us to this conclusion. So you have Christiana Figueres, who is head of the Secretariat, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, just a fantastic woman and really has been steering this over the last few years. And then Laurence Toubiana, who is the French ambassador on climate change. So while when you look across the negotiators, there are a lot of fantastic people, both men and women, probably not as many women as there should be, but you've got fantastic people all working towards an agreement which will be good for all of us, everyone. You did have two women who are not always in the front page or on the front cover, but who were really driving this. So I do think there was quite a bit of gender balance when you looked at who really led the final decision.
Can I just add a two-finger on that?
Oh, sorry.
I think you could even make the case that in the last few years, major progress on climate was only ever made when a woman was running the talks. So if you think to Cancun, when Patricia Espinosa really pulled that deal together and got a standing ovation. When you think about Durban. Foreign Minister Mashabani, it's actually been a great lesson for multilateralism.
I'm glad you said that, Paul.
and actually even Copenhagen, when Connie Hedegaard was actually in charge of it, it was going fine. Then the Prime Minister
stepped in. So Andrew, part of that question on gender was also on human rights.
Look, by the way, I think Brianna, you're asking a really interesting question, and I think that Mary Robinson has been a wonderful force for good. And she's been the Ban Ki-moon's special representative or envoy on climate, and it's her job to be very strong on human rights and on gender, and so I don't blame her saying that. Having said that, I mean, the plain fact of the matter is that whilst there is some language in the text about gender concerns and so on, addressing climate change, we now know there's a lot of research. Climate change hurts women and girls more, and because climate change actually intermediates itself through water primarily, and we do very sophisticated projections of 15,000 water basins in the world, and I was talking just yesterday with our gender advisor about this. It's overwhelming that a strong deal on climate will be good for everybody, but especially in poor countries I'm talking about. I mean, there is one other point there, in addition to, I agree with what you say, is that heads of state are overwhelmingly male. Ministers of Environment who actually run this are not, interestingly. I mean, Tina Sundtoft of Norway, Barbara Hendrick of Germany, Senegaline Royale of France. You want to meet Isabella Teixeira of Brazil. My goodness, I mean, very, very.
Gina McCarthy.
Sorry.
Gina McCarthy.
And so I mean, it's not to disagree with the point, because I think the point's a very good one. It has to be said again and again and again. But I think there's some progress. On human rights, I mean, that was a very big issue throughout. Look, again, human rights are being abused today. We're losing the battle against climate change, and the poor are suffering. I'll leave it to the lawyer here You're not, oh no, you're a philosopher. So that's even better. So I'll leave it to the philosophers to talk about that. So, personally, you know, the precise language, you know, how many times are the two words human rights written down in a document is much less important than what will be achieved by this. And just two other points. One, just to support very much what Helen said on land. I mean, it's the restoration movement is now gaining unbelievable political momentum, and Paris deserves a lot of credit for that. By restoration, we mean the fact that there are 2 billion hectares in the world that used to be forest and now have very little value. They're very low productivity agriculture, sort of grasslands, or just like alang-alang grass in Indonesia. Terrible waste. And in the last year, there's been an amazing sort of increase in interest at the political level. One of the things we did there, along with partners and the African Union, we brought together 12 ministers from Africa to make a commitment to 100 million hectares. And at the same time, brought along a lot of investors and banks, development banks, to make a commitment. And that was last weekend that was done as part of what was called Landscapes Weekend, where there were 400 people spent the weekend together. And so I really believe that this part of the climate agenda is really going to catch on, because the political attractiveness of this is very great, which is, you think about it, up there's carbon in the air, in the atmosphere. It's actually killing people, and it will kill a lot more people. What you can do is you can bring it down to earth and turn it into trees and bushes and soil and crops. And you could bring, poverty reduction, you could bring resilience, you could increase yields, and you can help address climate change in a very fundamental way. So this is something that is going to grow and grow. Just one final point on John's point about sort of the kind of notion of a tipping point. How there are countries out there, what will really get this to really catch on? I think that's sort of what you're getting at. And it made me think of sort of, what is a revolution? I mean, when does something change quicker than you think across a range of countries? And there have been several in the past. I mean, for example, in 1980, the vast majority of countries ran their economies badly. They had big budget deficits, they had closed trade, they had distorted markets, they had multiple exchange rates, they had multiple interest rates in financial systems. Everything that a sort of a well-trained economist should say, this is just not smart. And everybody said, Mike, it would take us forever to get rid of that. Between 1985 and 2000, more than 100 countries radically changed the way they run their economies. And the question is why? And it's something to do with serious analysis that's built up, some pilot successes that actually, oh my goodness, this actually works. And then it is a political process where leaders talk to each other, and it happens regionally. It happened in Latin America before it happened, or it happened in East Asia, and it sort of spreads around. That's what has to happen now. And we're very, very close to that happening. People say, my goodness me, 78% of all the energy in the world today is fossil-based, something like that. It's going to take 100 years to change it. But then you actually look at what's happening. Last year, more than half of all the new installed capacity of electricity in the world was renewable. And in the first 9 months of this year, I think the number is 74% of all of the new capacity in the United States was wind and solar. And you start thinking, actually, we can get an entire turnover in the life of a power plant. Power plants last between 40 and 50 years, so all you have to do is stop building the old-fashioned power plants built on coal and actually gas. And within 40 years, you're on a, do you know? And the issue is for, on transport, the pace of battery improvement at 7% a year, it means, should that continue, and we hope with Elon Musk, and this, I should have mentioned, we all should have mentioned this wonderful thing that you did on the Mission Impossible. No, the Mission
Innovation.
Mission Innovation.
The name was Prime Minister Modi's idea.
Well, it's a very good name. I'm pulling it
said
like this is an incredibly good thing, and then linking it to with 7% a year improvement. That means by 2030, For $30,000, you'll be able to buy an electric car that does almost 500 miles to one charge. Will anybody ever buy an internal combustion engine again, ever after that? And a car only lasts 10, 15 years. So in other words, the turnover can be much quicker than we think, and that's what we've got to work towards.
Great, thank you.
So I'll just briefly, even though I'm not a lawyer,
You're better than a lawyer.
not, I will make no comparative comment. If you look at the agreement, part of the overall text, it's in the preambular section, paragraphs 11 and 12, and there was a lot of back and forth over this throughout the 2 weeks of the COP, is where you'll sort of see the paragraphs that speak to human rights, rights of indigenous peoples, support for gender equality, empowerment of women, intergenerational equity. And there was a debate throughout the COP, I think more in the first week than in the second week, over whether there should also be a placement of that language, of a sort of embrace of those priorities in more operative sections of the text. And essentially what happened was it was just one of those things where every time the parties were able to agree to a wording either for the section in the way it was put in the preamble or the way it was put in the operative sections of the text, it would get a lot of other stuff would just get loaded in, and so it kind of became unacceptable, and so you couldn't reach consensus on the text. So I think that how it landed, given what a back and forth there was actually quite good and quite positive. With the one exception of 7.5, so Article 7, Paragraph 5 on adaptation, actually is a very, very nice substantive paragraph on the importance of traditional knowledge, gender-responsive participatory processes for engaging in adaptation measures. And so I think it's a quite
your hymnal.
if you want to, you can look at this later, but it is 7.5 where you can find a really kind of a very, very interesting, and especially what Paul mentioned earlier, that I think that truly one of the most interesting, what will of necessity be some of the biggest policy innovation we need, is really going to be on the adaptation side. I mean, there is a very strong marker there for how comprehensive and sensitive and how comprehensive that approach needs to be. So I think it wound up there. There's also a very good, strong paragraph for people in the labor community in the preamble to just transition of the workforce. And I know that was something that the U.S. delegation in particular fought very hard for. So I think that it's there. There is a sense, I think, for folks who are really interested in sort of the human rights framing, right, for climate change. And I know that the Mary Robinson Foundation was actually quite in the work that they did with WRI on the climate justice dialogue. That was kind of, I believe, as I recall it, one of those things that that the Mary Robinson and her foundation were looking at as some of the things that could come out of that as a driver. My personal view on this is that there is an incredibly interesting academic literature on the relationship between human rights and climate change that is still seeking the best way to operationalize that. And I think that's part of this. Is not just because we have this agreement here, it doesn't mean that the conversation over all that stuff stops at all. In fact, it is just the platform, I think, for figuring out how to improve that moving forward.
What about this question of fresh seed money financing and opportunity costs for poverty alleviation programming?
I think one of the really wonderful things that's happened is that this deal has come out just 3 months after the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
Because the one thing we've learned, in the lead up to the Sustainable Development Goals, really for the last 2 years, everybody has been saying, don't mix the two together. There's climate here, it's a different constituency, then there's the UN Sustainable Development. Don't sort of try and inject them into each other. Now that they're done, it is obvious that they are, I was going to say mirror images, but they're the same thing. If you pick, there are 169 Sustainable Development Goals, and overwhelmingly they're designed not about climate. If you pick a dozen of them carefully that are not designed to help the climate at all, you will find that implementing those will achieve 75 to 90% of what we need to do to address climate. So everything from the way we design modern cities, the sustainable energy for all, even things like that we work on a lot is food loss and waste. There's a sustainable development goal that says halve all food loss and waste. 1/3 of all food is lost and waste. If food and loss and waste were a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter in the world after China and the United States. So in other words, you cut by half food loss and waste, and by the way, it uses land more than the size of China. So think of farming the whole of China and then taking the food and throwing it away. And by the way, in that doing, you are putting all kinds of horrible things into the methane from rice paddies and from cattle and other animals, carbon from soils, and above all, you're clearing land in forests. That's just dreadful. So that's just one example of something that you shouldn't be addressing food loss and waste because of climate. You should do it because it'd be fabulous for food security and incomes and so on, and the future of food. But it just happens to get you there. And so that is true for a dozen. So in a way, the old idea that you should keep climate finance over here and development finance here, that's gone forever, which is a very good thing.
Great. So you have 30 seconds. You all step into the elevator here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. You're leaving, and you meet someone who did not attend today's session. They said, "What were you just doing?" And he said, "I've been talking about COP21." And they say, "What's that?" What do you say? 30 seconds.
Oh, me first. Thank you very much. We
Oh my word.
Exactly right. For 21 years, we've been working on trying to get an agreement on climate change that brings all of the major emitters, all the parties that need to be at the table together. We have succeeded in doing this. This is potentially one of the most important things that's ever been done for your children, your grandchildren, children you may have met once, and their welfare in the future. Here's my card. Let's have a look.
Your turn.
Okay. It was an absolutely historic opportunity where countries, 195 countries, came together with the business community, with investors, with cities, with states, with civil society, and actually agreed to pivot to a low-carbon economy.
Thank you.
And resilient, sorry.
Paul?
Well, those are great descriptions. I guess another way of saying it is that the nations of the world may have finally solved the thorniest problem in international relations, and now it's on. Now we can stop pointing at leaders and politicians, and we need to figure out the practical solutions to get us to the goals we've set.
Thank you. Andrew?
Wow. People may think this is an environmental decision, but actually, if we see through what we started in Paris, our lives will be altogether different and altogether better. We will live in communities that are more compact. We will live in societies that are actually healthier and more resilient. We will be able to feed the world in 2060 when we have 9.7 billion people. And we will be proud of what we've done for our children. So, to steal one of your lines, good cop, bad cop, this was a good cop.
Oh,
You don't mind.
that was well done. So for one more minute, as we think about our discussion today, Laurent Fabius, the president of COP21, called the final agreement differentiated, fair, dynamic, durable, balanced, and legally binding. And I think we talked about those various elements. I think we talked about it being landmark, the landmark architecture that really is changing, a game changer, where all countries have signed up. I think we talked about the opportunities around innovation, science-based targets, the climate economy. We took that next to talk about the processes. We talked about climate diplomacy, the multi-stakeholder processes, the politics, and sort of game changers like China being part of driving towards the change, we also weren't afraid to look at the criticisms. Where do the challenges still lay? Where is it, to what degree, which components of the agreement are not legally binding? Will the US be able to deliver? What do we know about the challenges for financing, and how can we keep track of that? And then finally, looking towards implementation, our points on transparency, competition, and credibility, and what that means as we look at these 5-year increments in reporting. So please join me in thanking Andrew, Paul, Helen, and Andrew. Fantastic job.
This is pretty snazzy, I must say.
Not